Hello, I'm Dr. Ron England. If you've been watching my previous lectures, you'll see that I've made a quadratic equation calculator. But this time I'm going to add something really special to that equation calculator. And I'm going to go back over here to jsfiddle, and I'm going to toss in some numbers to my little quadratic equation calculator. And let's say we do this, and I'm going to hit the plot button. And now you can see that I actually can get a plot of this. And this is all written in JavaScript. So I'm going to show you how I was able to write this little calculator, this right here in JavaScript. So let's first go back to our HTML. And before I do that, I'm going to show you some samples here. But what I'm going to show you first is, where did I get the plotting from? If you go to highcharts.com, there's a nice plotting library in highcharts.com that you can access and use that allow you to create plots. So I'm going to show you how to do this. Now, if you go to the demo gallery, you can see one of the things that you look at the demo gallery is that these things actually can be edited in jsfiddle, just like the other stuff that we're doing. And it'll point out that you have two libraries that are JavaScript libraries that you need to incorporate to do this. So this is the highcharts.js and the exporting.js. Now, I'm going to come over here and show you how I actually did that. In jsfiddle, I can do the include to put that script in there, but the difference between the JavaScripts that are over here is they're loading in the head, and over here I'm doing it as on load. But it's also got the capability of being able to manage resources. And what we mean by resources are libraries that you externally access and use. So if you were to take the URL of the highcharts.js and put it in here and click the plus, it will add it down here as one of the libraries you have access to. And the other library is the exporting.js. So these two libraries that are available from Highcharts and Highcharts in this case is acting as a CDN, which means they're making the library publicly available to you to link to. You can go over here in jsfiddle and add them over here, and it's going to go ahead and make them libraries that are externally linked to. So that gives you a good capability of testing this. Now, if you're creating this in HTML, you simply have to put the script with the external link to these libraries. And also note that the framework being used here is jQuery, so you would also have to have a link to the jQuery. That all done, realize that these links have to exist. Let's see how we create this plotting. Well, there's only a few things that I changed from the previous quadratic equation calculator. As before, I got the information in, and as before, but now I've added a second button called plot, and I've added a second space. I've added a div where I've specifically, I'm going to put this information, and the div is called container. So the plot is going to go into container. I've also, coming down here into the JavaScript, because I'm going to use the variables in multiple functions, I've taken the variable declarations out of the function calculate, and I've put it out here outside this. What this does is it makes the variables a, b, c, n, x, y, and v all to be global variables. And what I've done with x and y, in a previous example, x and y were just a single number. I've actually created an array. I'm going to make an array of them. Okay. I've also created this variable called v, which contains, by the way, both x and y. It's going to be an array of arrays. Okay, an array of arrays. And the internal arrays will just be a simple two-dimensional array of x and y. And I'll show you how I do that. All right, down here I've also taken this function calculate. And what I've done in calculate is I've removed the display information from this function that was in the previous example. So I have a second function called display values where I define s, I put all of s together, and notice in this time when I create the calculate, it fills in the values of x of I, y of I, and v of I. Now x of I is going to be the values of x that you do by using the minimum and the maximum of x and just basically incrementing by 1. The y of I is going to be the calculated value, which uses the xt variable to go and calculate the value. And v of I has an array open, an array closed, But internally, index of 0 and index of 1 of that are the x and the y. So it is an array of points. But a point is an array. A point is an array with a 0-indexed x and a 1-indexed y. And an array of points, because you can make an array of anything. You can make arrays of objects, arrays of values, arrays of points. If a point is a two-dimensional array, an array of points is simply that, an array of points. This is all stuff that hopefully you've gotten into programming before dealing with arrays, but this is a very quick and short primer of what I'm doing here. Now, down here in display values, this is where I actually do continue to have this ability to hit calculate, and it gives you those values which are output right here. Well, all I'm doing here is I'm now taking, for I equals 0 to n, I'm going ahead and putting the x of I and the y of I in there. And because it was stored in an array up here in calculate, I can now display it down here in display values. Now, of course, I have to call calculate before I do that. And how do I do that? Well, if you go to the very bottom here, when I associate the click to the calculate button, this function now has two calls, one to calculate and one to display values. What this allows me to do is make some very consistent code here, because now I've got a second button called plot. And when you click plot, you still calculate, and then you plot the values. And plotting values does nothing more than plotting the values. Displaying the values does nothing more than displaying the values, but both of them have to calculate the values first. So I'm keeping with a very nice, tight syntax and logic. So I'm going to go through display values a little bit here. I define a string variable. I put, just like I did before, the y equals 1x squared plus 2x. Okay, it puts that in there to show what the equation is. And then I run through a for next loop where I output both the x and the y values. Now, the function that really is the cool function is the plot values. Okay, I didn't need to call calculate here before the plot values, but in this case I did, because when you click on the plot, it does, so it's doing the calculations twice. The rest of this is dependent upon specifically how the Highcharts library works. And I chose the Highcharts library for a plotting library, and there are multiple plotting libraries because it's relatively easy to follow. And the way this works is, first you create an object which is a new Highcharts chart. Okay? And inside of Highcharts chart, it has a number of properties and property values that you need to set. And they are hierarchical property values. So one of the values that you would have within a Highcharts chart would be the actual chart property. And the chart property has values such as render to, type, margin right, and margin bottom. If you notice, the syntax here looks like the syntax, very much like the syntax in cascading style sheets. Now the reason for that is just simply the way the Highcharts plotting library was written to look at what you're doing here. So when I create a new chart, internally it has in it a chart, and it tells it where it's going to render the chart to. Container is this div up here, the container. That's where it's going to go. Then you have a number of types. Okay, in this situation, you have type line. Now I can change the types, and in this case, I'm going to change it. If I change type to scatter, okay, which is a pretty neat type, and I hit run, okay, I can now put in some values here. 1. I'm going to move this over just a little bit so I can do this. I'll say -3 and 2, and I hit plot, okay, and it makes a little scatter plot of that, okay, and that actually is a scatter plot. The values are done like a scatter plot. If you do a line chart, okay, and a scatter plot, this axis is proportional to the numbers that you have in the axis. In a line chart, if the first number is 1 and the next number is 20, okay, well, it's not necessarily still working at the proportionality of this. So scatter and line have different ways that they behave, but they both look relatively the same. All right, now, going back over to this, I can set a title. There's my title. I can set an x-axis, okay, which just says x. I can set a y-axis, which you can see here says y, okay? And the syntax is you open with a bracket, close with a bracket, open with a bracket, close with a bracket, and sometimes different properties will have sub-properties which have their own open and close brackets. Plot options just are just specific options, and what I did is I took some plot options that I took from the Highcharts that said these are plot options that would be relatively good for what you're doing based on examples that they had, and I just simply put them up there. One of the nice things is you notice it's got this little value thing here, which is kind of neat, that you can actually hover over values and it shows you what the value is, and I enabled that. Okay. Now, the data is really where the real power is here in the data, and in this case, the series, okay, is named y values. You can see the y values down there. It's named y values. The color, well, that's pretty easy. I can actually do this. I can take that color, and suppose I want to use my color picker and make it this blue color I have here. I can now paste that in as a new color, Control V. Now, if I run it, okay, and I now have to put values in again for, let's say, -2 and 3 and plot. Okay, notice that they're now blue. Okay, the values are now a blue value, and that's the color that I actually picked from there. But notice the data. Well, the data is using V. Where does V come from? V is this array that you defined up here as a global array, and the array is an array of two-dimensional points. And points are simply a two-dimensional array, and so you have an array of two-dimensional arrays, which are points, and it knows when it sees an array of two-dimensional arrays how to translate that and use it. Okay, it's relatively straightforward and simple. So you can have some fun playing around with different ways to do charts. This is what I actually want you to do is take some time. One, you are going to have to do a problem where you have to plot some equation. And I'll give you some other good examples of plotting. The other place to go for good examples of plotting would be the actual Highcharts website, because they show you and have really good documentation of all the options that you have to do in a chart. But simply put, here, you create a chart, you set the properties of the chart with this syntax, and then here, when I've called to create the chart and the chart is rendered to a container, it will show up on your screen automatically. So you can see this is not terribly difficult. It looks really difficult when you first start, but in reality is, once you dissect the pieces of the JavaScript that are going here and realize that a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by the libraries, you can do some pretty amazing things. So this has really got the point of saying, how do you use JavaScript libraries and how do you put together a website that can do some pretty neat stuff like plotting? This is how you do it. So hopefully this is very useful to you, and good programming.